I'm Ramanand Krishnamurti, Chief Energy Officer here at the University of Houston. We have an outstanding panel here today and a fantastic moderator, and I'd like to thank everyone for their participation here tonight. I know there's a big event going on about a mile from here, but I think this is going to be more fireworks than that one. I'd like to thank our media partners, Houston Public Media, who helped spread the word and get you all out here. And also like to thank our President's Energy Advisory Board. They've been sort of the thought leaders behind this symposium series. They started us off, as I mentioned, 7 years ago on this idea, and they have continued to support and build this program. Two of them are on the panel today, and will share with us some of the insight. And I noticed there are a few others in the audience here. The board is made up of industry leaders and experts, and give UH and UH Energy strategic guidance to advance energy education and research. I'd also like to thank the other UH faculty who are here and energy fellows who contribute to these symposia, blogs, and most recently, a really fantastic set of white papers that have gone into depth on a variety of issues. I'd like to thank our student volunteers from the largest student organization at the University of Houston called the Energy Coalition, and they are 7,000 members strong and growing, and just a fantastic, vibrant group of students. Quick few notes. The symposium is being streamed live, so if you decide that you want to partake of any part of the debate, you can watch this simultaneously. It's on our Facebook page, but I'm sure you'll want to stay here. So, and this video will be available to you on YouTube sometime early next week. Q&A. We do this with a unique way of doing it. We ask you to take out your cell phones, submit your questions online at this website. This will keep popping up periodically. It's fairly easy, uh.edu/energy/ask. And we will look at those questions and work with the moderator to have them be posed to the panel. If for some reason your question does not get asked, you will have an opportunity to ask the panelists directly after the symposium when we get together upstairs for our reception. Without further delay, let me start off by introducing our moderator, Robinson Meyer. Robinson is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He covers climate change. He has reported from Capitol Hill, the Greenland ice sheet, the Viking ruins of the Faroe Islands, among other places. In 2018, he contributed to an investigation that found then EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt had bypassed the White House to give large raises to favored aides, reporting said to influence Pruitt's resignation 4 months later. Meyer has appeared on NPR, MSNBC, BBC, and other major broadcast outlets to discuss his work. He was an inaugural winner of the SEAL Award in Environmental Journalism in 2017. He joined The Atlantic in 2013 and lives in Washington, D.C., and has made it here. And I'm delighted to start off this panel with Robinson. Robinson?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Krishnamurti, for hosting me and for hosting us. Before I get in, I want to welcome the rest of our panelists today, which I will now do. To my immediate right is Christy Clark. She's the former Premier of British Columbia in Canada, and a current senior advisor at Bennett Jones, LLP. Christy led Canada's third largest province for over 6 years. Throughout her tenure, she demonstrated the strongest performance of any Canadian premier for economic growth, fiscal management, and job creation. As a premier, she set an ambitious goal to create a liquefied natural gas industry in British Columbia, and during her time in office, 3 LNG pipeline projects received their federal approvals, with multiple more project approvals in process. Last year, Shell finalized its decision to start construction on a $40 billion LNG Canada project. Is that 40 billion US or Canadian? Canadian, okay.
That's a big discount.
The largest Well, I was trying to think, when it's a book, right, you always hope it's the Canadian price. So, as a consumer, I'm very happy. The largest single private sector investment in Canadian history, and as I mentioned earlier, she's a senior advisor today at Bennett Jones LLP. To her right is Dr. Ajay Mehta. He's the general manager for New Energies Research and Technology at Shell Oil Company. He works in Shell's technology organization where I've already read that line. He leads a global team of over 100 scientists and engineers dedicated to developing innovative and competitive technologies to meet the demand for more and cleaner energy. He's worked at Shell for all of his 23 years of his career, and he's assumed a wide range of technical and leadership roles, including deepwater R&D, product operations, CO2 mitigation, project engineering, and general management. He's a subject matter expert on natural gas hydrates and has served as a distinguished lecturer for the Society of Petroleum Engineers. He also BS in chemical engineering from the National Institute of Technology in Karnataka, India, a PhD in chemical engineering from the Colorado School of Mines, and an MBA from MIT. And last but certainly not least is John Hofmeister, who is the former president of Shell Oil Company. Upon retirement from Shell in 2008, he founded and now heads the 501c3 national membership organization called Citizens for Affordable Energy. It's registered in Washington, D.C., and it's a public policy education firm that promotes sound U.S. energy security solutions for the nation, including a range of affordable energy supplies, efficiency improvements, essential infrastructure, sustainable environmental policies, and public education on energy issues. When he was president of Shell, Hofmeister led an extensive outreach program unprecedented in the energy industry to discuss critical global energy challenges. It included an 18-month, 50-city engagement program across the country, during which he led 250 other Shell leaders to meet with more than 15,000 business, community, and civic leaders, policymakers, and academics to discuss what must be done to ensure affordable, available energy for the future. My salute for leading 250 other executives in a tour of the country. And a business leader who has participated in the inner workings of multiple industries for over 35 years. He has also held executive leadership positions in General Electric, Nortel, and Allied Signal. And he's the author of Why We Hate the Oil Companies, Straight Talk from an Energy Insider. Let's give a round of applause to our three guests today. Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank you all for being here. I know that if you were interested in an event about public policy, climate change, maybe energy, there were very few options on campus in the city of Houston tonight, but we're glad you chose this one. I want to also thank Laura and Alyssa for helping arrange my visit. They made it very easy. Excellent. I'm going to start with two stories. One has pretty photos, the other doesn't, but we'll cope. I recently visited Greenland. I realize that's a little ominous these days, coming from someone who lives in Washington, but it was a great visit. It's a gorgeous country. The people there are have an incredible history, and I recommend everyone goes. I was traveling with climate scientists studying the Vikings who once lived in the island south. One day we finished field work early, took a detour, we had extra time, we went for a hike. Southern Greenland is this amazing place. It is covered in these mountains and hills that would be completely noteworthy and famous if they were in the continental United States, but there, many of them at most have local names and also sometimes just have numbers. So we took a hike and got to the top of one of the kind of more magnificent of these local hills. And I looked to the north. Let's see if, there it is. And I noticed there was this incredible thing shining in the sun to the north. It kind of looked like a mesa, but it wasn't. It kind of looked like an ocean, but of course it was like white and then elevated. It was a glacier, obviously, but it didn't look like the kind of glacier you would see here, because behind it there was this seemingly infinite expanse of white that stretched all the way to the horizon. It looked like a sea, but it wasn't. And I realized, oh my goodness, that's the Greenland ice sheet. That's like 5% of the world's water. I'm just looking at it right there. And then I turned around and I realized that I could also see the ocean where I was standing too. It was a great view. We were on a fjord. And I could see all the way out to sea. I could see down the fjord, icebergs kind of scattered down, and then you see the ocean. And that's actually shining in the sun, And I realized there was the ocean, and there was the ice sheet. And they were both these giant, flat expanses of matter, of water. But the ice sheet was hundreds of feet above the ocean. And the ice sheet also continued. I mean, we all know the oceans are big, but the ice sheet also continued for an absolutely staggering amount of distance. You could, I was looking today, there's this wonderful website called thetruesizeof.com that I recommend wasting a lot of time on. You can drag any country or continent or kind of geographical entity around on the world, and it moves it out of the Mercator projection. So there's some places in the world I find very hard to think about, including Greenland, because they're so distorted by the way we normally look at maps. TrueSizeOf.com, this ends my infomercial. If you put Houston where I was standing looking at the ice sheet all the way at the south, Greenland stretches all the way up into Canada. Of course, if you were to drop Greenland in a very different way, it would be a kind of terrible news for about 100 million people who would instantly be crushed. But you could get all the way to New York with Houston in the same place in relation to Greenland. I tell this story because I think we all get used to hearing about climate change. We hear it and the energy economy that must kind of follow as a result of climate change. We hear about it as a topic of liberal guilt. We hear about it as something we might be able to adapt to. I think we don't always understand it when we hear about it. It seems like it's going to be sometimes a one-and-done apocalypse, or sometimes just another kind of change in the weather like we've endured in the past. But I guess I want to back up for a second and just suggest that it's something much more profound. And for that, I need the second story, which was there's one fact in the very, very recent United Nations report on climate change that stood out to me. It's very early in the report. A lot of folks missed it. It said, quote, people currently use 1/4 to 1/3 of land's potential net primary production for food, feed, fiber, timber, and energy. That's 1/4 to 1/3 of land's potential net primary production for food, feed, fiber, timber, and energy. So recall from high school biology that primary production, most of the time, is the conversion of sunlight into chemical energy via photosynthesis. It's the thing that, as far as we know, plants are one of the very few things in the universe that can do. That's the net primary production that the IPCC, the UN's scientific body, is alluding to. It's saying that the human demand for food, meat, clothes, and warmth, which is exactly what's symbolized by food, feed, fiber, timber, and energy. Food, meat, clothes, and warmth now consumes 25% of the net product of photosynthesis on land. At its most, it consumes 1/3 of the net product of photosynthesis on land. That's all that basic chemical energy, 1/3 of, like 1 out of every 3 sugar molecules made by plants in dirt on Earth gets sucked into the economy somehow. And this is, I think, a far better way to understand climate change. It's that the huge, hulking, machine of our material metabolism, which we normally call the global economy, is just sucking an enormous amount of energy into it right now. That's 1 out of every 3 sugar molecules, when you don't even count the most energetic sections of the economy, which are the energy, oil and gas and coal. And that production is what's currently messing up the economy, what's currently moving what's currently messing up the planet, what's currently moving all that water up there down here. And so what we're talking about is not a kind of normal environmental issue. What we're talking about is not something that results from our guilt as a species or our failure to do the right thing most of the time. What we're talking about is a profound consequence of how our economy and how we as a society suck in just raw material right now. And that also, I think, hints at the scale of what we need to do. I want to just go over a few numbers before I turn it over to our panelists. Right now, here's US decarbonization so far. So if we want this new economy where at some point by the end of this century, we are no longer emitting new carbon dioxide molecules into the air, this is what we've done so far. It's about 16% by 2020 if you take the most optimistic estimate. It's a little less than that right now. Right now, since our all-time peak in 2005 as the United States, we have decarbonized about 1% per year. If you use the extremely sophisticated energy modeling technique of drawing the line forward, then we decarbonize by about 2100. Of course, economies of scale kick in at some point, but just drawing the line forward, we could decarbonize in our current policy environment 2100-ish as the United States. And that is apart from the world, of course, and it's also worse than almost any of the policy outcomes we've been discussing lately. So almost any other decarbonization timeline requires some kind of intervention between now and whenever we want to stop emitting carbon dioxide. If we want to hit 2070, which Shell has discussed, you can see it's about, I think, 50% faster than we're going right now. If you want to hit 2050, which is the timeline that almost every Democratic candidate has proposed and will propose tonight, it's much, much faster. I mean, it's just a completely different rate of change. Submit your questions for me now. The point being that we are decarbonizing slowly. The new energy economy is coming, but it is of an enormous scale. And what we're doing right now and the kind of policies that we're discussing right now have not so far created anything like even the rate of change that Shell says we need to hit their target. With that, I turn it over to former Premier Clark, and thank you for your time. And look forward to discussion later.
Thank you, Robinson.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much, Robinson. So you just went to Greenland, didn't you, Robinson? Yeah. You went to Greenland. Did you make an offer? Make him an offer and get the...
It wasn't what I was looking for.
Really? You wanted to be popular while you were in town anyway. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here at the University of Houston. The work you're doing in energy is vital, and it's changing people's thinking all over the world. I don't think that there is a center like this at a university anywhere in the world, and we're better to do it than the center of the world's energy economy, which is here in Houston. So thank you very much for having me. Dr. Krishnamurti, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. It was nice I met him in Newfoundland. Has anybody here ever heard of Newfoundland? Okay, has anybody here ever been to Newfoundland? Oh, wow, 3 people, that's fantastic. Beautiful place, joined Canada about 10 years before Hawaii joined the United States. Big energy economy, lots of oil and lots of gas that they're working on getting out of the ground. Now, I wanted to talk to you today. 6 minutes allocated to me, so don't time me, please. I want to talk about 3 questions in my time tonight. First one is this: should we be moving to the new energy economy or something like it that people are talking about in America and around the world now? The second thing is it technically and is it politically possible? And those are two very different things. And the third one is, if we can do it, what are the lessons that we should keep in mind if we want to make sure that we get it done? How could we do it? So I was thinking about you guys this week, and I thought, okay, I'll put together a nice slide deck. And so I went through and, you look up climate change, and here's what I got. Devastating fires in California, Indian farmer crouching on his desiccated land beside his dead sheep, families displaced by floods and hurricanes. And this one's Hurricane Katrina. But I only have 6 minutes, so I thought rather than pounding you with apocalyptic pictures of what climate change is doing to us now, I thought I would just show you a picture of all the natural disasters that have been happening since 1900 around the world that have been recorded. And what you see in this is you see that uptick in the 1980s when it all really got going, and see the increase from 1965, when I was born, to just a few years ago, or today, when it's at 300 and 400. And so to me, that's the statistic that I think should keep us awake at night. And in answer to your question, to the question posed, should we do something about climate change? Absolutely, we should. And in my view, climate change is being fueled by economic growth around the world. And that economic growth is being principally fueled by fossil fuels, coal, oil, principally, also hopefully more and more natural gas. And as those countries in places like China and India struggle to join the middle class, and millions of them are in China and India. I mean, in fact, we have seen the greatest poverty reduction in the world's history, in human history, in the last many years because of the work that's happened in India and China, in large part because of the trading regime that we've set up that America created for global commerce. Growth means more emissions. More carbon accelerates climate change, and climate change means more natural disasters. That is what that chart is all about. So yes, we should do something about it, and we should move to a low emissions economy in the United States and in Canada. But is it possible? So we have the technology, and the folks that have put together the new Green Deal have lots of ideas for us around that. If we wanted to do it in 10 years, which might be desirable, but not possible. I mean, when you think about the fact that it's fossil fuels that have knit together the world economy since before the turn of the last century, how do we take fossil fuels out of the economy in one fell swoop in 10 years without massive economic dislocation? It just simply cannot be done. But what you can do, is you can pull all of the combustible engine vehicles off the road. You can decommission all of the coal and LNG and oil extraction and refining. You can, or all the plants, you can stop all the extraction. You can digitize the power grid. You can force building upgrades on Americans from coast to coast to make them zero emission. And you can radically change the way Americans farm and ranch. We have the technology to do that. We know what to do. But we don't, I would argue, have the will, and I would argue we do have the wisdom not to do it. Now, I think the signatories to the Green New Deal, many of them say it's aspirational, to be perfectly fair to them. I think the folks in the Sunshine Movement, Sunrise Movement, would say, hell yeah, we should do that. Let's get on it. But I don't think it's realistic, and I don't even think that some of those changes are desirable over the long term. Massively expensive, millions of people tossed out of work. They would have the bizarre consequence, additionally, of making it impossible for America, or harder, for America and Canada to help the developing world reduce their emissions as well. And it is impossible to do it without a massive public outcry. Imagine the ranchers and the truckers and the rig pigs and every middle-aged mother like me who drives a car. We would be manning the barricades and demanding a change in government. And even Canadians would fight. Now, we would feel very bad about it, and we might apologize a lot, but if I can get this to work.
Americans truly apologize for our total awesomeness.
Yeah, it's too
I'm not that
I'm so sorry. Sorry, I didn't. Were you even playing? I don't even. Were they playing?
sorry, America.
Oh, hey, fellas, real sorry, eh? We're so sorry.
Sorry, America. He's sorry too.
Sorry. Like super sorry.
Okay, so you know we're good at it. And I love that video because it is an example of Canadians celebrating the fact that we beat you guys in Sochi at the Olympics for the gold medal in hockey. And I know nobody cares about hockey down here, but, you know, in Canada there really isn't any football. There was really no baseball, a little bit of baseball, and, you know, on basketball we're probably one and done. So we love our hockey, and I feel like I'm bragging, so I have to say sorry to you about that. So, yes, we can get to a lower emission economy, but it's going to take a lot longer than a decade. We need more time to get it done without massive economic displacement, and we need more technological breakthroughs, quite frankly. We were talking tonight about Bill Gates and his investment that he's made for the last 7 years in a carbon capture facility in Squamish, just outside Vancouver in my province. And what they're doing is they're pulling carbon from the air, and what they're trying to do with it is turn that carbon that they've pulled from the air into energy. Those are the kinds of huge technological breakthroughs that we need over the next few years if we want to get this done. But as we work to get there, I want to offer 5 thoughts on the things that we need to think about. The first one is this. The US and Canada cannot fight climate change on our own. And this slide shows you the carbon emissions from the United States, I don't even, is Canada, yeah, Canada's in there, and versus China. 15% plus 2%, 28% for China. And then this slide shows how much China, India, and Asia's emissions are going to grow. So the US and Canada are the two top, you're the big blue line, we're the little red line, and then China is the big purple chunk, India, and then other Asian countries. Their demand for oil is going to be more than double what ours is going to be by 2030. Now, if we want to make sure that we can make a contribution to that, to helping solve the problem in Asia and India, we have to do some things differently. And we have to recognize that no matter what Americans and Canadians do, and we should do it to try and move to a low-carbon economy, we will not solve climate change until we address the problems that Asia and India are having. And they very much want to. Prime Minister Modi and President Xi are working they talk about it frequently, and you know why? I mean, maybe they care about climate change, but they care about revolution. There are 2 things that are going to drive the Chinese to revolution. The first is corruption, and the second is pollution. Mothers who are worried their children are going to die prematurely because they can't breathe clean air. Oh, hold on a second here, sorry. What slide am I on? Second, Remember that ours are mature economies. So we live in an economy where we're going to see our emissions remain relatively stable because we've invested in growth, we are wealthy, and we're in a very different place from developing countries. Those developing countries need a lot more power. And the truth of this is that contemplating a zero-emission economy is the privilege of rich nations. Poorer countries just don't have that option. They are too far behind economically, and they are just not ready to be able to take on the kind of challenge involved in a zero-carbon economy. And so the result of that, as you see, is you see a huge new appetite for fossil fuels opening up in places like China. And look at India, the Indian tiger awaking. So this chart tells you, this chart tells you, I'm getting a little off on my charts here, that how natural gas, coal, and LNG and oil compare in terms of emissions. And in terms of, you look at the NOx and the SOx and particulates as well. If we want to fight climate change, we have to supply the Asian countries with better forms of fuel, cleaner forms of fuel. And there is nothing dirtier than thermal coal. Look at that. That is coal emissions by fuels. Look at where coal sits on that. Now, I'm biased in this. We've just got a $40 million investment. The Shell plant's getting up and running. We have what could be the third biggest natural gas reserve anywhere in the world in British Columbia, and it's going to be the cleanest, greenest LNG produced anywhere in the world. But when you think about the fact that coal is the most damaging of all of the fuels that's being used around the world, and the fact that the Chinese and other countries are planning to build 1,000 new coal plants over the next year, we have to ask ourselves, how can we encourage our neighbors across the Pacific Rim to try and change that plan? We also produce, by the way, not just some of the cleanest oil and gas in the world, we also produce the most ethical gas and oil in the world. High wages, high environmental standards, workers come home safe every day from work. I was having this conversation with my son. He said that, he said, well, why shouldn't we get oil from Saudi Arabia? And I said, well, I mean, among other things, the Saudi Arabians just started letting women drive. And I'm not the best driver in the world. So my son says to me, I really think they're going to regret that decision. So fourth, the Paris Agreement. It provides opportunities and encouragement for developed countries and oil producers to be able to trade credits with countries that need our fuels, if it is displacing dirtier forms of fuel. So think about this. In British Columbia, my province, 4.5 million people, not a huge place. If every single person moved out of BC and there was nothing happening, we would reduce our emissions in Canada by less than we could at full capacity on a 4-train LNG plant, shipping it all to China with the amount of CO2 that we would displace. And in the Paris Agreement, it's called ITMOs, which are internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And the idea will encourage countries like Canada and the US to be able to move our cleaner natural gas over there to displace things like coal. And this fancy slide that you see is how they explain these ideas to politicians. Now, fifth of all, and last, I would say we do have to reduce our emissions on this continent. There's no question about that. But it is very politically difficult to do it, and you know that. And on that list of the one thing that every expert in this field says we must do as part of a credible climate plan is a carbon tax. And I know that's a third rail in American politics. In my province, we have been the model for carbon taxation. We haven't sent voters to the barricades. We haven't damaged the economy. It's been lauded by the World Bank and the United Nations as one of the very best carbon taxes in the world. And it worked. It worked because it reduced British Columbians' dependence on fossil fuels. So there we are compared to the rest of Canada. At the same time, our economy grew. And our economy grew because the money collected from the carbon tax, and I really do think this is the only way you can do a workable carbon tax, the money collected from the carbon tax, it's not like California, the money does not go into the government's pockets. Every penny of carbon tax goes back to citizens and businesses in the form of tax breaks. So it's what we call revenue neutral. And look at how much our economy grew in 2017. Look how much our job growth was, the last date that I could get a slide for. Jobs and growth happen in low tax environments. And our economy thrived because we took all of that carbon revenue and we invested it in creating a low tax environment. Now, I spent my time at university studying religion and politics. Don't laugh at me. But I did soak up a couple of courses in economics when I was there. And one of the things I learned is that price signals are the most important way to influence consumer behavior. And that's what this is. It's a tax shift with a price, it's a price signal in a tax shift. I have also learned that government policy only works when we are not imposing complex, untransparent, difficult solutions. And I would argue cap and trade probably has fit into that category in almost every jurisdiction where it's been tried. Government policy works when you give the private sector a choice of how they will behave. So if you cut their business taxes and raise their carbon taxes, you get a different answer than if you just said, we're taking the money and we're spending it on our pet projects. And politically, it's hugely important that those carbon taxes go back into the pockets of people. No one wants less money in their pocket, and nobody wants to lose their job. And more taxes being dumped on already overtaxed economies in North America doesn't stimulate economic growth. We shouldn't make people poorer, and we shouldn't kill their jobs in order to protect the environment, and I would argue that we don't have to. So 5 thoughts on how we can move forward. I don't think the path ahead is very easy. In fact, I know it's not. It really takes decisive corporate leadership, and I think we are seeing a lot more of that in North America in particular in the last many years. And it also takes brave leaders. It takes leaders who have the energy to take on these big, hard fights and who have the temerity to do what is right, not just what is going to get them reelected. That's what Canada needs. That's what America needs, ultimately, if we want to get to a clean energy economy. Thank you very much for having me today. Oh.
Great. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you today. I'm delighted to be at the University of Houston to just share a few thoughts from a Shell perspective of how we see ourselves thriving in the energy transition. There's a lot of fear about the energy transition, about how this is going to unfold over the next several decades. I'd just like to offer you a perspective on kind of how we see it unfolding and what kind of role we expect to be playing in the energy mix that emerges in the future. As with any corporate talk, however, I do have to start with the inevitable eye examination. So since I will be talking about some forward-looking projections, I would like to just have put this disclaimer up to keep my legal team happy that anything I say here today should not constitute advice for you to make an investment in Shell. So with that, moving on. What society really is looking for is a world in which we can supply more and cleaner energy. No town, in the world probably needs to really be reminded of the fact, and the last town, of course, being Houston, that energy and the economy are intricately connected. As we talk about a world in where the population is going to continue to grow, and we talk about the yearning for a better quality of life, it is going to require a significant uptake in the amount of energy that's required to meet that demand. So how do we, juxtapose this dilemma of the need for more energy, but which is much, much cleaner than what we're able to supply today? How do we go, from a position where we are today, where we need to double the size of the energy system as a whole, but we need to halve the CO2 emissions that, ensue as a consequence of the consumption of that energy? The first question to ask is, so how do we get here today? And this energy system that we see here today is a confluence of the supply side, the consumption of the energy, government policy, all of these coming together to constitute the energy system as we know it today. The energy system that we have today is fundamentally not changed at all in about 100 years. 100 years ago, if you looked at the mix of the energy system, 80% of the energy mix was based on fossil fuels. Fast forward to today, and 80% of the energy system is still made up of fossil fuels. So how do we go from the world where we are today, where we are looking at an increase in global population from 7 billion to 10 billion people, and provide that more and cleaner energy of the future? How do we look into a system where in the current projections in the current world that we have already, 1 billion people don't even have access to energy, and another 1 billion people have access to intermittent, energy? How do you go to a world where you want to adhere to the principles of the Paris Accord, and Shell has been a pretty public supporter of the Paris Accord? How do you ensure that with the status quo that we currently have, that there's no plausible scenario where you can be under 2 degrees C if there's not going to be fundamental change in the energy mix, as it's constituted today? So these are some very big fundamental questions, which again also go to the issue of how do we see the quality of life and the need for more energy, playing a role as more economies get into the quality of life that the first world has enjoyed. If you think about this in terms of the energy consumption per capita in the Western world and compare that to the energy consumption in the developing world, there's a massive, massive difference. The approximate energy consumption by somebody in the United States on a per annum basis is on the order of about 300 gigajoules. If you went to places like India and China, it's about between anywhere from 30 to 50 gigajoules. These countries are going to aspire to get to the same quality of life and standards as the first world. What is the right number? Who gets to prescribe, what is the right level of energy consumption? And how do we get to link the need for more energy and for the development of the world systems with also the need for acute decarbonization of major industrial sectors? Certain sectors of the economy are perhaps, in principle, easier to decarbonize. So if you think about sectors such as power generation, there really isn't a technology question about whether the power sector could be decarbonized. There are plenty of technology options available to do that. So in the grand scheme of things, it's relatively easier to decarbonize the power sector. Or if you think about the built infrastructure, again, in principle, it's easy, especially for the new built infrastructure, to decarbonize it based upon renewable and clean energy sources. Other sectors, such as the heavy industry sector, for instance, are much harder to decarbonize. Again, if you think about the clothes that we wear or the food that we eat, then these are processes that in principle, again, could be converted to renewable energy sources. They could be electrified. They require lower temperatures. The processes and the mechanical engineering unit operations that go with it can be handled with lower temperatures. But what about harder sectors which require much higher temperatures? What about steel, cement, chemicals? All these are sectors where the demand for higher temperatures for the processes that control the conversion of these materials, it's not that easy to go from an oil-based system to an electricity-based system. Think about the transportation sector. In the minds of many, the debate is over about light-duty vehicles and that the world is going to move towards electric vehicles. That's fantastic. What about mid-duty vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles? What about long-distance transportation, aviation, shipping? These are sectors that for some time to come are going to require liquid fuels in some form or the other. The question then is that are these liquid fuels going to continue to come from fossil-based liquids, or is technology going to play a role in coming up with alternatives to how we even make these liquid fuels for the future? So these are the kinds of dilemmas, that we have to face when we think about what it's going to take to move from the energy mix of today to the energy mix of tomorrow. One of the scenarios that Shell has come up with is called the SKY scenario. And as many of you might know, Shell has used its scenario thinking as kind of the basis for its long-term economic planning on how we kind of make investment decisions. In the past, our scenarios have been unconstrained, as in we put some boundary conditions and we let these scenarios evolve to guide us in terms of what future worlds might emerge. SKY is different. In SKY, we said, let's just assume that all the technology that is needed to move to a world where we do adhere over a 50-year time period by 2070 to get to a world of net zero. And if you're going to be doing that, you're kind of doing a goal-seeking exercise to say, what would it take for the world to move to a world where the net emissions, the global warming caused by CO2 emissions ensures that the temperature does not rise over 2 degrees C. And what you see in this next chart here is just a projection that we have of what a future system in 2070, a net zero emission system, might look like. So the picture that you see on the left side, the donut on the left, is the current status, where 80% of the energy mix, as I said, is based on fossil fuels. In 2070, that system is going to have about 20% basis in fossil fuels. 80% of that energy is going to have to come from renewable sources of energy. Perhaps the biggest change that you see out there is the slice that is shared by solar and wind, going in from less than 1% penetration of the energy system today to perhaps up to 45 to 50% in the years to come. That's a dramatic change. The other aspect, which is perhaps less explicit in charts like this, is that if you take a look at the energy system as a whole today, 20% of that energy is used towards generation of electricity. In a future world, that number is going to flip, where 80% of the total energy system is going to be based upon electricity. So we're looking at a shift over the next 50 years from a world of molecules to a world of electrons. But the part which should also not be misunderstood is that the size. Take a look at the size of the donut on the right side. It's nearly twice the size of the energy system on the left side. So fossil fuels will, yes, play a smaller role, but they are going to be playing a smaller role in a much bigger energy pie of the future as the world transitions to a low carbon energy system over the course of the next 40, 50 years. So how is SKY really going to come to fruition? The first step in SKY is massive electrification on a scale that is unprecedented. If you look back upon the rate at which electricity has been increasing its share in the total energy system, it's been about 2% every decade. That number is going to have to dramatically increase. We're going to have to triple the rate of electrification, and the net size of the electricity in the system will be 5 times the size that we have today. We're going to have to think about growing massive new energy systems. Renewable energy sources, regardless of which is your favorite type of renewable energy system, is going to have to play a very, very significant role in this energy mix of the future. Energy efficiency is not an endpoint. It is something that's going to have to be relentless year in and year out, and we're going to have to continue to extract more and more savings out of energy efficiency and how everything that we do, from the cars that we run to the buildings that we build, energy efficiency is going to have to be at the heart of that. Premier Clark talked about carbon tax. Couldn't agree with you more. Companies need more than anything else certainty in terms of policy. decisions, regardless of what is your favorite mechanism for carbon pricing, whether it be a carbon tax or it be a cap-and-trade system. Carbon pricing has to underpin any scenario in which we can make this transition. Carbon capture and storage, another area which is absolutely pivotal to meeting the 2 degrees C goals. Some of the things that you don't read in the fine print of the Paris Agreement is the fact that it just assumes that CCS is going to happen. So think about this right now. We have about 40 operating CCS plants globally. One of them that Shell operates in Canada is called Quest, which basically sequesters about 1 million tons of CO2 per annum. By 2070, we're going to need 10,000 carbon capture and sequestration plants. That's the scale that we are talking about of this energy transition. And the last part is around ending deforestation. This is perhaps one of the aspects that is less talked about in a lot of the public messaging that we hear around this. But ending deforestation and encouraging afforestation, these are huge carbon sinks. But it's going to require massive amounts of commitment from governments to make this a reality. And the seventh aspect which underpins all of this is changes in consumption patterns. We spend a lot of time thinking about the supply side of the equation. The demand side of the equation is also going to be changing based upon kind of how we choose to live. What kind of vehicles are people going to be riding in the future? Shared mobility, autonomous vehicles. What sort of net impact is this going to have on the energy system of the future? So I'd like to kind of wrap up by kind of just one picture to say that this is kind of all very interesting, but what is it that private companies are doing about it? And we've been very public again in kind of saying that we don't want to be a bystander in the energy transition. We want to be a player in whatever energy mix emerges over the course of the next several years. Some of the things that we are actively looking at is continuing to emphasize on the need to move towards an economy where gas continues to have a greater share of the economy. And certainly that's the way Shell has been relooking at its own portfolio of projects. We continue to provide oil and gas where, to meet the demand for liquid fuels, but we are also working on a number of technology options to create liquid fuels of the future, which are not going to be sourced based upon fossil fuels. You heard about some of these projects around direct air capture. These might have sounded like science fiction just 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but when you juxtapose the fact that you are going to have access to very low-cost electricity, and you can really make hydrogen at a very low cost with large-scale electrolyzers in place, capture CO2 from the atmosphere, you can now start thinking about creating synthetic fuels of the future to actually provide fuel for those sectors of the transportation segment which will continue to require liquid fuels in the future. Renewable energy, of course, is a central part of our strategy, and we are spending up to $2 billion a year in building a new energies business, again, looking across the entire sweep of renewable technologies. CCS has to, again, be part and parcel of that mix. Low carbon technologies, whether it be kind of third generation, second generation, third generation biofuels, hydrogen. Is the time right now for a hydrogen economy? We've been in the hydrogen field for a long time. Are the stars aligned now for hydrogen to really become a reality? We are looking at some major pilot projects in certain parts of the world, including in Japan and Australia, to actually provide hydrogen for the power sector. Hydrogen could play a very interesting role in the future. Continue to advocate CO2 pricing. And the final part that I'd like to re-emphasize that also Premier Clark talked about is that the scale of change is so massive that this is going to require a unique partnership between the public and the private sector. We are literally talking about transforming the energy mix of the future and rewiring the entire global energy mix as we know it. That is a humongous undertaking which should not be underestimated. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Good evening, and I have a homework assignment for you. If you have 10 minutes, pull up YouTube. Call up John Stewart, Daily Show, And for the next 10 minutes, watch John Stewart talk about U.S. energy independence using videotapes of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, all proclaiming their plan for the energy future of the country. Well, starting with Richard Nixon and gas lines, we did not have an energy plan other than importing oil. We imported a third of our oil to get through the day. Barack Obama, now Donald Trump, we still import a third of the oil to meet the demands of this country. I'm going to make a point here, ladies and gentlemen, which will come down to two major transition tools to the future of our energy system. In the interest of time, I'll be brief. But let me put it in two dimensions. The first dimension is Americans and citizens around the world respond not to government mandates, but to market opportunity. If we're going to change in the directions that we've heard about tonight, what has to change initially is how we see the market for energy. But let's not just define the markets for energy as the supply side. We've seen charts that describe the supply side, whether it's nuclear, wind, solar, oil, natural gas, geothermal, hydrogen, and so on. But it's also the marketing of efficiency and how we do more activity using less energy, both individually and at national levels, with all of the technologies available to use energy more wisely. Thirdly, it's marketing the significance of the environment to those who don't understand it. In my book, which Robinson mentioned 10 years ago, I said, rather than talk about climate change, let me talk about managing our waste. What is harmful in every nation in the world is that there is no price on waste when it comes to energy. So all the emissions, the particulates, all of the ash heaps, all of the various and sundry ways of consuming energy, there's no price on the waste of energy. Imagine if your household took all its weekly trash, anticipating the trash pickup on Monday or Tuesday or whenever, and instead of putting it out on the street, you just dumped it over the fence to the neighbor because you didn't want to pay your trash bill. That's what we do with energy waste. We put it into the environment, we put it onto the land, we put it into water with no penalty, no price. And so from an environmental standpoint, the marketing of cleaning up our environment is an individual responsibility as well as a collective responsibility. And fourth, we can't move energy from where it's produced to where it's consumed or permit energy to build new facilities, to put in a new solar panel system, put in a new electronic or electrical hookup system for electric battery vehicles. We can't do any of that without permits. So infrastructure, the physical and the legal infrastructure also has to be marketed. Companies know how to deal with that. Most Americans don't understand infrastructure as an essential part of the body of the nation. The infrastructure for energy is similar to the veins in your body. Your heart can pump, but if the veins don't take the blood throughout your body, you die. We need infrastructure as the veins of our energy system to move it from where it's produced to where it's consumed, regardless whether it's wind or solar or whatever it might be. So marketing, that's number one. We have to market to ourselves to change behaviors with the products and the technologies that make it all possible to have an energy transition of the magnitude that you've heard here tonight. The second, government should be an enabler, not a mandator. By enabler, what I mean is, instead of an elected official or an appointed official telling you what you will or you will not do, no, set in place those enablers that make things possible. So the carbon tax that the Premier described, it's an enabler. Now companies and people can go to work on taking advantage of that enabler. A carbon tax, a cap and trade. I spent years working on cap and trade during my tenure as Shell Oil president. And it didn't go anywhere. And it didn't go anywhere, not because it was totally opposed by the Republicans, which it was, but the House of Representatives passing the bill by a mere 7 votes out of the hundreds of representatives there. The Senate saw the House vote, and the democratically run Senate refused to take the bill to the floor. So the bill died because the Democratic Senate would not pick up the Democratic House bill because the Democratic White House at the time in 2008 and 9 said, we're not going to support the bill. So we got no cap and trade. That would have been a government enabler to make dramatic differences over the past decade. Here we are a decade later, and not only is there not a cap and trade bill going through Congress, there's not a carbon tax going through Congress. Nothing is happening because the atmosphere of government enabling was so polluted by the experience of the cap and trade, nobody wants to touch it. But the government must step up to produce the enablers, and tax is a good one. Other incentives could be considered as well, such as tax breaks for those who are enabling those companies which are marketing their products, their services for efficiency, for environmental cleanup, for changing the nature of the energy we use. Corporate leadership is not dumb. They go where the money is, and they create the markets. Look at what's happened in the last 20 years in this country and around the world with electronic technology, communications, and information management. We live in a new era when it comes to those three: communications, information management, electronic technology. We're never going back to dial phones, to copper wire phone connections, etc. So when it comes to the energy transition, please keep those two things in mind. Politicians telling what you will do are going to get unelected. Telling you have 10 years and that's it, and no more airplanes, and no more red meat, and no more whatever else it is that's talked about with the Green New Deal in 10 years, it's not going to happen. Those politicians won't be around because the people will not accept the degradation of their economy and their lifestyle for the sake of somebody's power trip. That's why we need enablers, not mandates. And so whether it's a Democrat or a Republican telling you where and what and how you have to do whatever it is you're going to do, that won't last. Not in an economy and in a political system that votes every 2 years. I call that political time in my course. Political time is the time between now and the next election, and people running for office or those wanting to be appointed for office will all sign up for whatever the candidate's mandate is going to be. But then you run into energy time. And energy time is measured in decades, not election cycles. So 10, 25, 50 years from now, the sky scenario, 2070, and you look at the magnitude of what's going to need to be done. And because we live in a democracy, we have choice over how our political system is operated, which is where we, again, come back to enablers. People can handle the term enablers. People can't handle the term mandates. Enablers and marketing. That's my message, ladies and gentlemen. Enablers and marketing moves us to transition the energy future of the world, which we'll all be much happier with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give our panelists another round of applause. And I want to remind you, the URL was up there. There we go. If you want to ask questions, that's the way to do it. Also, there was a question about how to ask questions if you don't have a mobile device or laptop. If you write it on a piece of paper and get it to Ramanan, he's around, and that's how we'll do it. I want to start with a question I've seen a little bit in the audience, and I can here draw upon my youthful urbanite privilege. Aren't we only here? Like, we've heard, I would say, two. I'm a reporter. I'm asking questions. We've heard two kind of cases against the Green New Deal. And I don't want to spend the rest of our time up here talking about the Green New Deal. Aren't we kind of only here about the here because of the Green New Deal? Didn't the fact that it was such a kind of out there proposal that was so different than anything else on the table, that then provided a place for provided a very progressive policy for Democrats to glom onto, only create the conversational space we're in right now, where we're talking about carbon taxes or cap and trade again? I understand why it makes sense to criticize the Green New Deal, but to some degree, if you're a Democrat who wants climate policy, why shouldn't you go support the Green New Deal? Because it seems to be the only thing that can get Republicans exercised enough to talk about carbon taxes and to support them. I guess I'd start with Premier Clark, even though you don't have to deal with our political system.
But I'm a close observer. let me just turn this on, sorry. I would say, I actually think that I disagree. There's lots of kooky stuff in the Green New Deal. There's lots of stuff that makes sense over time, though, too. And the Green New Deal is an important discussion for Americans to have. And the fact that it's become this partisan punching bag in the midst of an election cycle is really useful, because it means people are going to dig in deeper than they might have otherwise and figure out how they feel about those things. So yes, these kinds of interventions create conversation. And America has been the home of all kinds of kooky ideas, like, for example, modern democracy, things that people didn't think would work, the founding of the internet, nobody foresaw where that would go. So I agree with you. I don't think anybody would want to be, former or current politician would want to be caught saying, I think the Green New Deal is a great idea because it's aspirational, but that is actually true.
There's also a thing here where, is the Green New Deal banning farting cows, which appeared in that policy memo, or is it a kind of massive spending program? There's a number of different, the fact that this is an ill-defined policy under a single brand makes it a little tricky to discuss, too.
Yes, it's very hard in politics. You come up with these grand plans. There's always something that's going to catch people's eye. And the red meat caught my eye, too, for sure. And they have one car per family. How are you going to make that fly in America? But the thing is, though, Americans really need to catch up to the rest of the world, the rest of the developed world, when it comes to climate policy. And I think this discussion is helping, as long as it isn't further polarizing, which is also a possibility, is, I think, going to help move the dialogue forward.
John, do you?
Well, to be blunt, I think the Green New Deal is an insult to human intelligence. Bingo. Yeah. From this standpoint, the environment is so important and so critical, and technology is the root of how we change the energy system, that to suddenly put forth some political label on something will do two things. It'll turn off most Americans to supporting anyone who promotes the Green New Deal, which would be very unfortunate for those candidates. And number two, it would change the conversation away from what is truly a government enabler, like a carbon tax, which we have no way to know how do we get there. We've had Republicans put forward carbon tax. We've had Democrats put forward carbon tax at the national level. It's operating at certain state levels already, but we can't get consensus from intelligent representatives because they all face elections in the very near future. And nobody's come up with the revenue neutral carbon tax, which British Columbia has done, because nobody has had that level of dialogue and earnest discussion. The Green New Deal pollutes the conversation, in my opinion, and it actually deteriorates and pushes back the serious changes that we need to be making. I'd come at it a lot more low-key, but with a lot more leader determination to create that enabler that we can all agree on. We'll never agree on the Green New Deal because of the extremities that it calls into people's minds. You know, no more airplanes in 10 years. That was what was said. And I think it's notable that the Speaker...
I don't think the actual text of the bill
the
calls
Speaker,
for no
but
airplaning.
the Speaker of the House took down the Green New Deal off the House website within 24 hours because she could see the damage that it was already doing. And so that, to me, is a statement about the ridiculousness of it in terms of reality. I live in a world of reality, not a world of political hopefulness.
So what would you say to President Trump if you're trying to get him to support a carbon tax? And why has it? I agree. I mean, a revenue neutral carbon tax. I think recently 400 economists kind of across parties published a letter saying a revenue neutral carbon tax is the way to go. Why haven't we seen one?
I'd say to President Trump, you have your head in the ground. And as long as you have your head in the ground, you're going to leave behind a legacy that people will hate you for because of the consequences of what you're doing. I'm very blunt when I speak to politicians. I may wrap it around a little nicer way of saying it, but I didn't say his head was somewhere else. And but I think straight talk is missing in the political world in favor of too many popular symbols.
Premier Clark, what would you say to President Trump if you were to tell him to support your revenue neutral carbon tax like you have in BC?
Holy. Okay, well, first, I mean, it's an impossibility that President Trump would support a carbon tax. Can we start there? I think the second,
But why is that?
Well, I mean, the president is focused on industrial jobs in swing states. The president is focused on getting reelected. I mean, and I apologize, I'm not an American, so...
Oh, no, but we love it when other people talk about us.
Well...
It's so nice.
Everybody is talking about you guys now, and everybody's talking about your president. All over the world, I hope it makes you feel awesome. I think the problem in the White House, and this is a problem in populist-driven nationalist governments across the world, is they are way more focused on getting reelected than they are on doing the right thing. And so when President Trump is focused on coal country, and coal is not expanding in the United States, coal is being stopped at the border by Californians, Oregonians, and Washingtonians who don't want it to leave their state. They're trying to create a whole border that's cut off from thermal coal being exported to Asia. They failed, sadly, in British Columbia. I was trying to stop in BC too, but what's happened in BC is that all of the powder basin thermal coal is coming up through BC and finding its way to China. But I can't even really engage in that question, Robinson, because President Trump, swing states, climate change is not popular with the voters that he needs there, and coal is popular with enough of them.
Do you think this, as you mentioned, populist governments have this tendency to oppose, I think, policy of this kind?
Yes, and I think, further to what John had to say, populist governments tend to think about things fairly, or tend to express things fairly simplistically. It's very effective in public communications, and So the complexity of public policy is really lost in that public discussion. So you sort of find that the public dialogue is denuded when populist governments get elected. People become polarized, and certainly around the things like the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is the product of polarization on the left, and creating further polarization, I would argue, around that on the right. So, but that is the tenor of American politics these days, and I don't know. I don't see any opportunity for that to sort of transform over the next. We'll get to a new energy economy.
Do you think there's the same dynamic in Ontario right now? I have to.
No, I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I mean, Ontarians are the least polarized people around. They hate their government, which is quite a bit farther to the right. They took them about 2 months to start hating them. So it's just, Canada is becoming more polarized. Yeah. There's no question about that. But our degrees of remember, our political parties are like 1, 2, and 3, and your political parties are like 1 and 2. So it's all kind of scrunched in the middle. And
yeah,
when we say
3 Democrat. 1, 2, 3.
Kind of. It's like, yeah, sort of like nobody says, I hate unions, I love unions. It's all about, well, should they get a $5 raise or a $25 raise? It's just a little different kind of conversation.
Yeah. Audience question, and I apologize because we only have your email, and so rather than try to figure out your email from your name from your email, we'll just run anonymously. I am a supply chain management major pursuing a certificate in oil and gas, and I care very much about climate change. Should I feel threatened in regards to my career by this talk of decarbonization, among other things? I want to start with Ajay, because he hasn't spoken yet.
Yeah, great. No, thanks for the question. I think there is a myth that the energy transition is going to kind of, transpire overnight. So the existing businesses that we have in the oil and gas, sector are going to be around for decades to come. So there's no real fundamental reason for panic in terms of, the supply chains that have been set up. Will they change? Of course. Is there going to be a gradual diminishing of the conventional sources of oil and gas? Of course. But what's going to come up behind it is new supply chains are going to get created. If you just think about whether you're looking into integrated solar PV projects, to really do an integrated solar project at scale, we need to start talking about gigawatts. And doing things at gigawatt scale is going to require a massive amount of supply chain behind it. When you talk about offshore wind, that the United States is now getting into, offshore wind and floating wind technologies, in order to do the kinds of projects and the numbers that are required, are going to require a very intricate supply chain behind that too. So yes, the existing kind of supply chains will continue to be in operation for a long time to come, but there's also going to be other newer ones that will be developed to actually support the new energies agenda.
John?
I think it's a brilliant career path because supply chain management cuts across so much activity. And whether it's an integrated major oil company, whether it's a wind or solar company, they can't exist without supply chain. And so the technologies and the science and the processes that are learned are going to be essential to move electrons or molecules, which is the base of all energy, from where they're produced to the consumer. And that's all supply chain driven. And to do it efficiently and effectively and making use of artificial intelligence and blockchain and all the other kinds of advantages which are coming along, I have to be precise. One of my former students from University of Houston is currently doing exceptionally well in supply chain management at a major integrated oil major. And in 3 years, he's been promoted a couple of times already because he brought so much with him to the company. And so I'm a big fan of people who want to pursue anything in energy, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's whatever energy, because energy, I mentioned the veins in your body as infrastructure. Well, the blood in your body is energy. And so it's going to continuously impact every citizen in the world.
Here's a question for the whole panel that gets to something you were talking about energy waste, which is, what is the role, especially in first world nations, of conservation in a new energy global economy? And The asker is still here. I assume that conservation is referencing conservation of energy? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. On the individual and corporate level. So yeah, so what's the role of conservation and of energy in the new economy?
Well,
in first world nations, especially where right now so much of our energy is waste heat.
I use the term efficiency as similar to conservation, because efficiency is about doing more with less. And that's what conservation is about, doing whatever you have to do with less impact on the environment. And so when I think about what, and there's a beautiful new book coming out by, the author's last name is McAfee, it's coming out in October. And it's how the US and other first world economies are doing so much more with less because of information management and how information management enables us to not use paper. I mean, just think how much energy we save by not using paper. Blockchain enables complex solutions to be put forward, which can be articulated in less steel, less metal of other sorts, less electrons ultimately, in terms of, you need a lot of electrons to run the blockchain and the process associated, but then you end up with solutions that don't lead to other major investments because you're optimizing your current infrastructure with blockchain. So I think conservation is going to take many forms. When it comes down to individuals and the behavior of individuals, I think when we ultimately shift to whether it's hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, battery electric vehicles, we will see tremendous efficiency, because the internal combustion engine, after 100 years of development, is only 20% efficient. And an electric vehicle is upwards of 50+% efficient. So imagine that multiplied by hundreds of millions of people who now own an electric vehicle rather than an internal combustion engine vehicle. That's conservation at the heart of it.
Yeah. Ajay, you mentioned efficiency during
Yes.
the talk. Do you think there's, so I want to just give you a crack at the question, but also, do you think there's policies that need to change? Because there are areas of efficiency that
Absolutely.
are really classic market failures.
Yeah, no, thanks. I don't think one can get into the business of telling people how to live and how, prescribing what choices they make as individuals. But when you do kind of take a look at a macro view of energy consumption in the first world, there is a tremendous amount of waste in the way we live. There is a tremendous amount of waste in terms of the houses that we build, the infrastructure that we have. And some of these are legacy, have historical roots of how we have gotten to where we are. But the conversion to higher efficiency homes in the future, which is kind of why I emphasize that if you take a look at the built infrastructure and you thought about kind of what will the built infrastructure of the future need to look like, there are choices that we can make. There are choices we can make in terms of how our homes are insulated. There are choices that we can make in terms of what kind of vehicles we're going to ride. There are choices we can make in terms of what is the personal footprint, that we choose to have. But I don't think those are things that one can prescribe. I think some of these will happen organically, with kind of people understanding that, by moving into to a higher energy efficiency option is actually also going to save money. When you start kind of thinking in terms of kind of how it actually individually hits the wallet, I think you're going to start seeing changes in consumption patterns. From a policy intervention perspective, I remain a little bit more doubtful about whether policy can really enable energy efficiency gains. I think there are certain things that could be prescribed as minimum mandates, that would enable, if you had some guidelines and standards that would come into place, building codes, transportation vehicles, etc. Yeah, it can certainly help, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to end up being individual choice.
Yeah, I was going to say building codes seem like the key. I mean, we know there's a market failure, for instance, is if you're putting up housing and you're a landlord, you're never going to face those heating bills. And that maybe, I was going to say, does that seem like a place where there's some policy potential, or?
I think there's potential for sure, but I don't necessarily have an answer on what I would prescribe.
Yeah. Do you think this was a question for me, but I want to turn it to you, and then I guess I'll answer. Could the public accept zero carbon fuel? That's which I think here means either kind of carbon capture or air to fuels, right? Or just carbon removed for every hydrocarbon molecule burned as green. Do you think that will be as acceptable as other zero carbon energy options like wind and solar, or as popular?
If you look at the transportation segment, again, as I said, even if the entire world stopped, let's consider a scenario where all internal combustion engines are banned tomorrow, essentially. You cannot even use the ICE engine vehicle that you have, and you cannot build any new ones. And you aggregate that to what is the net impact of that in terms of the liquid fuel consumption patterns. Depending upon whatever scenario you want to look at, that's going to kind of make an impact of anywhere from 7 to 10 million barrels of oil per day, from a system that consumes 90 million barrels of oil per day. So I put that statistic out to you just to kind of put this whole argument in context, of what it is that we're talking about. Electrons are always going to be the most efficient way to power light-duty vehicles. It's got kind of electrons in, electrons out. If you can do that, fantastic. But there will be segments, as I said, which will require liquid fuels. Question is that how are you going to provide those liquid fuels? I personally think it's going to be a mix. There's going to be conventional oil and gas, which will play a significant role in that sector. But if you can offset that, by going after carbon capture and sequestration with a purpose, not just kind of, waiting for somebody to kind of come up with the right policy incentives, because that's what it's going to require. It's again going to require public-private ownership. So something that's always going to cost you money to do, which is cash negative, it's going to be very hard to get that penetration into the marketplace. So yes, you can continue to look at other options, but at the same time, there is technology that is telling us that perhaps over the course of the next 30 to 40 years, we can think of a world in which we can make synthetic fuels. So that's kind of the R&D side of the piece that I'm talking about. So I don't think it's an either or. I think you're going to need to have all of these options in the mix.
Do you think that's something that the public would welcome?
At the
or
right
do you
price
think it's not
point,
going to matter
yes,
because if the price is right, great.
Yeah. I think that, let me make sure I understand your question. Is your question that would the public accept a zero emissions fuel?
The question is, will they accept it as green?
So think about this, that if you really got to a scenario where you can successfully capture carbon dioxide from the air, yes, by using a liquid fuel, you are going to be putting in CO2 back into the atmosphere. One of the things that sometimes does not come up in the conversations is that when we talk about net carbon footprint, 15% of the carbon dioxide that comes out is coming in from the generation side. 85% of it is end of tailpipe emissions, or in the products that are used as a consequence of the fuel that we produce. So when you kind of put that whole thing together, and you kind of think of a scenario where you are really making a synthetic fuel, where the CO2 is actually coming in from the atmosphere. If you can really truly create a circular path for that CO2, whereby you are not putting in any net new CO2 into the atmosphere, and you're not actually getting the carbon from the ground. And again, this could be a very small sliver of the total, liquid fuels requirement.
Yeah.
I think that's a win-win situation. Or with conventional oil and gas with CCS, that could be a win-win situation.
Yeah. I want to go to one last question, and then we'll wrap up, just for all the panelists. Starting with Premier Clark. Keeping political will aside, what can Houston do to effectively deal with climate change and continue to remain the energy capital?
Well, Houston has the benefit of being the headquarters for all of the biggest companies in the world, close to the headquarters, the real headquarters. And I think, companies like Shell are embracing ideas like carbon tax, a sensible carbon tax, or cap and trade. That's true of a lot of the biggest companies. Much more difficult for the little guys to be able to deal with emissions and pipe leakages and those kinds of things. But for the big companies that are based here, I think Houston, it would be revolutionary if politicians in Houston came out and said, we've got to do something about climate change. No one would believe that that proposal had come from this city, the world center. If there was one big thing that Houston could do to contribute to helping America catch up on the climate change policy front, it would be to come out and publicly support a carbon tax and whatever other elements of a climate plan that the city would see fit to endorse, as a way to, I would argue, insulate the American industry against changes around the world and ensure that American entrepreneurs and businesses are ahead of the curve on this one so that they can continue to thrive in the city.
Thank you. Dr. Mehta.
So I think having lived here for more than 24 years, I think this is a town which doesn't whine. It just rolls up its sleeves and gets on with it. And I think that is something that really distinguishes what the city can transform into. Yes, we've been known as the oil and gas capital of the world. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that we can be the energy capital of the world, regardless of what that source of the energy is. And we are already seeing a lot of those green shoots in Houston. Within the city, there are some initiatives that have been kicked off by the mayor here, which is looking into creating a vibrant innovation district inside the city of Houston, where we can start thinking actively about putting all of the minds that have so successfully built the energy system of today towards what might that renewable-based energy system of the future look like. What might a world where the city incentivizes electrification of vehicles, builds the infrastructure to enable that. I think we have got all the ingredients and the minds and the universities and the talent and the people in the city to make it happen.
Thank you, John.
Well, I'm happy to say that all of the major oil company CEOs and boards of directors have endorsed a carbon tax. And they're asking the political system to please provide the legal enablers to make it happen. But I agree with Ajay. I think the human capital of Houston is without exception. I worked for years in the aerospace industry. And when I consider what does the aerospace industry do to keep us up in the air or exploring interplanetary explorations, I think of the oil and gas industry as having every bit the technical challenge, the intellectual property challenge of not going up, but going down. And what has happened in the decarbonization chart, which I think you showed earlier, almost all of that is due to natural gas and the conversion from coal to natural gas. That natural gas opportunity and the technologies associated with horizontal drilling. Imagine going down 5 miles and going to the right. Mm-hmm. How do you make a well that's a right angle? You're bending steel under the ground 5 miles below, or whether it's 35,000 below the ocean, where you got 10,000. First 10,000 feet in the ocean is easy. It's water. It's the next 25,000 feet that's challenging. But again, being able to use directional drilling and things like that, I think the opportunity to expand that into efficiency and infrastructure and all of the other aspects, I think it's the human capital that's going to do it.
Great, thank you so much. And let's give our panelists another round of applause.
I want to thank the panel again for a fantastic discussion. I know there were about 60 questions that were there. We got to ask about 5 or 6. So there's plenty of opportunity to have that conversation. If you go up the stairs into the ballroom, there will be a sort of get-together. There'll be some food and some drinks, and the panelists will be there. I'll give you a chance to get to chat with them. But fantastic conversation. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ajay. And thank you, Robin. I really appreciate it.